We're very lucky to have with us a brilliant expert panel. El-Sadany is a human rights lawyer and executive director of the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, and that's an organization that works to center MENA expertise in MENA policy. John Allen, we have already had the introduction, but is the former Canadian ambassador to Israel. And Annelle, Sheline, I got your name right this time. Okay, brilliant. Is a research fellow at the Quincy Institute and former foreign affairs officer at the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor's Office of Near Eastern Affairs. The way we're going to structure this section, I almost feel like we should have jumping jacks or something right now. I know that's the point we're at. But we're going to have some opening remarks. I sent a couple questions to the speakers in advance, and they're going to address these questions. And then we're going to have a discussion where I'll pose a series of follow-up questions based on their responses, and then we're going to open up the panel to everyone here. So, John, can I let you take over? And the two questions I asked them in advance, just to let you know, are: do you think international law can be used to limit the violence in the Middle East, and if so, how? And has the legitimacy of international law been affected by the wars in Gaza and Lebanon, and what will be the long-term repercussions if it has? So, thanks, John.
Thank you, Jeremy. I have to begin by saying that I have neither practiced international law nor taught it for a long time. So my views are going to be a little impressionistic. I'm going to address the second question first, and I'm going to say that I think it may be too early to say definitively whether and how the legitimacy of international law, particularly international humanitarian law, has been affected by the wars in Gaza and in Lebanon. I think we also have to be realistic and recognize that international law, and especially international humanitarian law, weren't designed or intended to stop or to prevent wars. They were, and it is hoped that providing rules for the conduct of wars, that they would limit the horrors of those wars by way of deterrence and by the fact that the rules have been incorporated into the manuals of war, of states, and hopefully into the mindsets and into the moral guideposts for soldiers fighting those wars. Clearly, international humanitarian law did little to prevent Yahya Sinwar and his co-militants from planning and executing a horrific attack on October 7 and from subjecting the Palestinian people in Gaza to the horrors of the IDF's response. It has also not succeeded in limiting the death and the destruction that the IDF has wreaked on innocent Palestinians in Gaza. Before his death, Sinwar either denied or minimized the actions of his self-described fellow martyrs on October 7. He then told the New York Times that Hamas would repeat October 7 again and again. He also told the same paper, when asked why innocent Palestinians were not being sheltered in the tunnels, that the tunnels were for his fighters and that the rest of the Palestinians in Gaza were the responsibility of the international community. International humanitarian law also did not prevent the IDF from imposing a siege on the Gaza Strip for almost 2 weeks, and then seriously limiting the amount of humanitarian assistance getting into the Strip being delivered to the approximately 2.2 million people in Gaza for a year. The sometimes indiscriminate bombing, the wholesale destruction of infrastructure, and the frequent targeting of hospitals and schools were also in many cases clear violations of international humanitarian law. Yet, some Israeli officials and politicians continue to claim that the IDF is, quote, the most moral army in the world. What is not yet clear is what the outcome of the ICJ case determining whether Israel has committed genocide, what it will be, and whether the ICC, the International Criminal Court, will accept the request by its prosecutor to issue warrants for Israel's Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu and its ex-Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant. The request for arrests for Yahya Sinwar and his two Hamas deputies, I presume, will not be acted upon, as they have all been killed. The fact that these cases have been instigated and that the International Court of Justice recently also has heard cases alleging genocide in the Ukraine and in Myanmar is positive. Should we expect Prime Minister Netanyahu, President Putin, or the generals in Myanmar to cease their actions? Unlikely. Will countries, including Canada and its allies, abide by an international criminal court ruling to arrest Prime Minister Netanyahu if he enters their territory? Not sure. If so, we can argue that the international humanitarian law has indeed gained some legitimacy. We can also find hope in the fact that Vladimir Putin did not attend a BRICS summit in South Africa approximately a year ago, or this year's G20 meeting in Brazil, for fear of being arrested in that country. Focusing now on the Canadian government, I was disappointed, as I said earlier, that the Minister of Foreign Affairs, when asked for her comments on the decision by the prosecutor of the ICC to request arrest warrants for both Israeli and Hamas leaders, when she criticized the prosecutor for suggesting a moral equivalency. This is particularly concerning given Canada's key role in bringing the court into being and its support for it until now. In my view, as I said, each request was made on the merits of each case, and the fact that they were announced at the same time did not or was not intended to suggest any moral equivalency. 6 respected international lawyers, including Ted Meron, a former Israeli legal advisor, supported the prosecutor's action. Finally, many are wondering why the court is yet to rule on the prosecutor's request. It will also be interesting to see how Canada reacts to the decision of the ICJ if the court determines that Israel has committed genocide in Gaza. And I would just say to the distinguished ambassador of South Africa, a determination of whether Israel has committed genocide has not yet been made. There was a prima facie case. That's right. And plausible genocide is a prima facie case. It is not a finding of genocide. And I think we should all be careful not to throw around the word genocide because it is very, very serious. I'm not suggesting Israel has not committed genocide. I'm waiting for the International Court of Justice to make that finding. I have said that I think Israel has committed war crimes. I think it has committed crimes against humanity. And I'm not trying to make just a legal point here. I think the crime of genocide is at a certain level, and if the court so determines it, then it determines it. Finally, I would say we should all be very concerned about what actions a Trump administration might take vis-a-vis both the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court once it takes power in January. Trump has already threatened to prevent the prosecutor from entering the United States and threatened other undetermined sanctions on the ICC. in particular. Thanks very much.
Okay. Thank you again to the Institute for having me, and thank you for organizing this important discussion. My answer to the question will revolve around two key statements. One, there's no doubt that international law has failed to stop or prevent mass atrocities in Gaza and Lebanon. And second, even in the face of this existential moment of crisis, international law can be saved, and it is worth saving. Let's get straight into it. In Gaza and Lebanon, we've seen a plethora of crimes, from indiscriminate attacks on civilians to the targeting of hospitals, from the intentional crime of forced displacement to the weaponization of starvation. Some of the world's top international legal scholars and practitioners have presented open and shut cases establishing violations of not only international humanitarian law, but also international human rights law, and they've made cases for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Despite tens, if not hundreds, of human rights reports and media headlines, despite harrowing video and photo footage, despite firsthand accounts, and even a finding from the world's highest court of a plausible case for genocide, the war has not stopped. Israel has not stopped its abuses, and a number of states have continued to supply Israel with the weapons necessary for these abuses to continue. And so naturally, this leaves many with the question of, what good is international law if not to stop more children from losing their limbs, if not to stop entire family trees from being eradicated, and if not to ensure that life-saving medical assistance be able to reach those who are most in need? In this dark moment, Gaza and Lebanon have made clear three things that I think a lot of us in the international legal community have been talking about for a while. The first is that international law is a tool. It is only as strong to the degree that we cite to it, leverage it, extend it, fight for it. It, much like any other, and maybe even more so than domestic law, is subject to politicization. It's subject to weaponization, particularly because almost 200 countries are contesting it and trying to use it to their liking on a day-to-day basis. Second, international law and the rules-based order are not the same thing. Increasingly, we've seen Western states, primarily the US, but not solely, talk about this concept of a rules-based order that's unwritten, that's vague, that's not universally agreed to, and that treats countries differently depending on where they fall. And so it's critical that we distinguish between the two and not allow for the concept of the rules-based order to water down what is clear and established international law. 3, international law and the current international legal system are reflections of the moment from which they were born, a moment that was not without its racial and hegemonic biases. And this is something that international lawyers. For example, we see this in the UN Security Council, whose veto power has been counterproductive to the purpose of international law, to the purpose of peace and security. And so it's critical that we come to terms with this, and many in Wales scholarship are having these types of discussions. I argue that these limitations of international law that Gaza and Lebanon have exposed should not be a reason for us to forsake the concept, but rather to grab on and fight and change these things, particularly, but not solely, because we know that bad actors do everything in their power to appear that they are compliant with international law. And therein lies the key. There's a power in that this isn't something that people have forsaken, but rather it's an active space for contestation. And so should we really forsake international law and leave us in a world where there is no law of war? I think not. Or should we really be protecting the positive norms that international law has been able to establish, intent on invoking it, and push for more progressive interpretations and reform? I think the latter. And before I conclude, I do want to say that despite this difficult moment, despite this crisis, Gaza and Lebanon have also shown us the power of international law when it is creatively reclaimed by non-traditional states, by civil society, and leveraged to make a difference in people's lives. A year ago, I'd venture to guess that many in the policy community had not heard of the International Court of Justice. Or maybe they'd heard of it, but they thought of it as kind of an archaic body that hears disputes between states and is not in the headlines. That's certainly changed now. And I think it's a clear example of how when these bodies have life breathed into them, they can truly be tools, and it's up to us how we use them. We've seen how the ICJ, even preliminary orders, have contributed to the media narrative. They've contributed to the way people speak about the issues, and we've seen how these harrowing wars have started conversations that are difficult but important on whether a state should remain in the UN General Assembly when it consistently violates the Charter, or whether the UN Security Council veto should be circumvented when issues of peace and security are at stake. We've also seen lawyers and advocates take the ICJ preliminary orders and use them in very smart ways. We've seen them use them to change domestic policy, to bring domestic litigation in national courts. And as a result of these efforts, we have seen impact. For example, the Dutch government was ordered to halt the export of F-35 fighter jets to Israel, in part because of the ICJ order. That was something that lawyers took up and then built a case and activated the decision. We've also seen the Norwegian government respond to the ICJ order, the other ICJ order on the occupation, by updating its advice to businesses, telling them not to engage in cooperation or trade with Israel if it perpetuates Israel's illegal presence in Palestine, or else they may risk litigation. And we've seen, for example, Japan's biggest trading firm end its partnership with a major Israeli defense company, and they cited the ICJ order in their decision-making. And so, though not at the scale we may want to see in this moment to end this war, to save lives, these successes do make a material difference, particularly when they are added up together, when they are part of a larger strategic plan, and when they are part of a larger commitment to breathe life into international law, to really deliver on the promise that it once had. And behind them all is a decision to stay in the fight. I believe we're only just scratching the surface, and I look forward to discussing more.
Annelle.
So I'll try to keep my comments short, recognizing it's been a long day and we're over time. Also acknowledging that I am not a specialist in international law. Another comment is typical of Americans. I'm going to shift the focus to the United States, and specifically acknowledging the ways that the U.S. has been uniquely responsible for preventing our international institutions from holding Israel accountable. To answer Jeremy's question, I mean, it seems clear that especially under the incoming Trump administration, I do not expect to see international law being able to constrain violence in the Middle East, but it is equally clear that it has been incapable of doing so during the past 408 days. Furthermore, that Palestine represents a failure of international law going back to the establishment of the post-World War II order and the establishment of the institutions set up to things like the UN and the UN Security Council, which, as my colleagues have acknowledged, were not necessarily set up in order to provide for accountability or justice. They were set up to allow for an international system that would not once again devolve into another world war. And so it is arguable that these institutions have actually been functioning as they were designed to do, by allowing the United States to veto resolutions that would have constrained Israel, for example. Or recently, we saw Russia veto a resolution at the UN Security Council trying to address the humanitarian catastrophe in Sudan. I would argue that this posits the need for reform, as my colleague indicated, that this is not an indication that we need to get rid of these institutions or international law writ large, but that they are in significant need of reform. And while I condemn the actions of the Biden administration in many ways over the past year plus, I think another significant area where a significant failure was they had said they were going to introduce 2 rotating seats for African nations to the UN Security Council, which they unfortunately failed to do. So all that to say, the insights that I can bring really have a lot more to do with U.S. credibility as an advocate for human rights on the world stage. This was what I was responsible for while I was working at the U.S. State Department in the office responsible for human rights promotion in the Middle East. And I can say, before October 7th, it wasn't as if U.S. credibility on human rights was all that strong anyway. I remember a particular meeting where my colleagues and I were engaging with Arab counterparts about the need to promote human rights, and our counterparts brought up the issue of Iraq, the illegal U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. And afterwards, my colleague rolled my eyes at me and said, they're still upset about that? And, for me, I think about what will be the long-term effect of U.S. actions over the past 13 plus months. What damage has the United States done to its ability to advocate for human rights, to advocate for international law? If the U.S. manages to come out of the coming Trump regime and return to a position on the world stage or would be interested in doing so, I fear that it will be impossible for the U.S. to regain this lost credibility. To be clear, after October 7th, it also became almost impossible to advocate for human rights at all. Within my own office, we would reach out to members of civil society who we were previously very closely in touch with, and they wouldn't answer our phone calls. We would set up meetings with members of civil society who were facing severe repression in their home countries, for example, in North Africa, and they would only want to talk about Gaza, which we could only, we had no answers for them because we ourselves in our office were horrified by what was happening. So just all that to say, I think that one additional point is, as I've been speaking about the loss of U.S. credibility in the sphere of human rights and international law over the past year, someone brought up the question, do you actually think that there's an instance where a country which would have made a particular decision has now, in the context of this U.S. loss of credibility over Gaza, that they would make a different decision, which is sort of the fundamental question of the IR theory of realism. Under realpolitik, countries just pursue their own interests. And I would argue that yes, absolutely, you do have instances where, for example, the Biden administration's relatively successful effort to cohere a coalition of countries to sanction Russia following the invasion of Ukraine, or other instances where countries have to put aside perhaps their own self-interest in order to preserve a broader goal, something, for example, like the Paris Climate Accords or other future necessary international cooperation to address climate change. I think it is under these circumstances where the United States will realize that by squandering the admittedly limited credibility the U.S. still had as an advocate for human rights and international law more broadly, that this will be where we will live to regret the decisions that have been made over the past year. I'll stop there.
Okay. Thanks. Thank you very much. I was just asked to announce that we're going to extend this session, give you a little bit more time until 6:30, but that the Trump 2.0, the special session on Trump 2.0 in the Middle East has been canceled. I think we're kind of touching on it, though, and I know, Annelle, you were part of that, normally part of that session. So we'll have a bit more time for questions. I have some questions first. And I want to ask you, just based on the conversation we've had, and I have a feeling, an interest in upholding international law. There's that sense that this is not a group of realists necessarily that are going to say that international law is not important, but maybe it needs to be adjusted or tweaked, but definitely reinforced. And this is where I want to get to, and I think it's sort of come up in the conversation. Do you see a potential divergence between global north interpretations of international law? I know your answer may. And global south interpretations of international law? If so, what might that mean, and how might this difference be bridged? And anybody can start. And where's the global north, everybody? Have we even agreed on it? Generally, like the Western countries, Japan, and global south, generally the countries that were colonized, right?
I'll give it a shot, but I hope my co-panelists will jump in as well. I think the rules-based order, this concept of the rules-based order, came out of an attempt to reinterpret international law in a way that benefits primarily the U.S., but also U.S. allied countries. That's where I see it, because it's this vague concept. It sounds often very similar to international law. It's less tangible, but often it's a replacement for respect of a certain set of guidelines that seem to be what international law should have been. So this is, I think, this is a key replacement. But I will say many countries reinterpret, apply international law in the way that benefits them. There are plenty of bad actors in the global majority that do the same thing. We have countries who talk about now is not the time for the application of political rights, and we're focusing on social and economic rights. So it's common. Every state does it. But I think what we're seeing here is just how jarring it is and how it's so blatant, and I think this is where the issue lies. International law, it's there. There is room for interpretation. That's why there are differences of opinion. That's why there's different interpretations. But I think what's happening here is a politicization of things that are quite clear in a way that is harmful to the purpose. And I think that's what we really need to contend with. And I don't think it's always based on global majority versus not. On Palestine, it very may well be, but Palestine is not the only issue, I think, once we get into other issues in the MENA region. So I would leave it there.
I think the global south versus global north debate is often related to what you were saying, which is, and it actually impacted the U.S.'s ability to gather that coalition against Ukraine, where the global south said, look at Iraq, now you're telling us to join with you because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Frankly, you're not the superpower that should be telling us what to do, and we're not going to give up our interests around the world just so that we can join you and sanction Russia. Where I do think there is a difference between not necessarily the global south and the global north is between China and some of its allies and the West. Because China and I would say to some extent India, and with Russia's support, is now beginning to try and emphasize collective rights, economic rights, as opposed to civil and political and individual rights. And I think they're working very hard within the UN system to make that happen, and therefore reduce any criticism of them for what's going on with the Uyghurs or Muslims in India, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a game being played, but I agree that international law, international rights, as we know them, they may have been developed by the West and by the North, but they're still pretty basic. We're talking basic human rights, and they shouldn't be tampered with.
Just quickly weigh in. Someone recently said, I think just provocatively, the global south doesn't exist. I think just to sum up the way that it's not actually all that useful to try to sum up the global south as somehow monolithic or pursuing a set of particular interests. At the same time, I do think, to your question of how the global north interacts with international law in contrast to the global south, I mean, as Mai said, the idea behind international law is to have a universal application of a standard of laws and practices. And so for weaker countries, many of the global south, perhaps one could think of these as countries that have historically been less empowered, that they see international law as both more important to their interests in terms of this universal application, but at the same time, in its actual application, they do not see that universality actually being applied. And so, I think a crucial takeaway, especially for efforts to impose accountability on the State of Israel, has been this pushback from the United States and the general notion that institutions like the ICC are intended for African warlords or, maybe Eastern European warlords, but certainly not Americans and certainly not Israelis.
Your senator from North Carolina might have mentioned that, right? Lindsey Graham. South Carolina. I'm Canadian. We don't know much about the United States. We don't center it, pay much attention. Yeah. So the opposite of you. No. What does a world? I want to ask the three of you. What I think we get a sense that international law has not been totally forsaken. What does but maybe we're concerned about it, and I'm going to ask the three of you, what does a world that has forsaken international law mean to you? What happens if we say, well, what if, as a result of Gaza, none of this really matters anymore? Maybe the North and South, this doesn't matter anymore. John, the concern that you can see countries sort of taking a different path because of their own interests. What would this world look like to you if we just don't have international law? What should we be concerned about? Or is international law just a way to make the world better? That'd be another way to put it, too.
I think at least widespread impunity. I think in many cases, folks talk about how the failure to hold previous war criminals accountable has paved the way for what we see in Gaza. It's also what paved the way for a second front to be opened in Lebanon. I think that's, for me, one key takeaway. It's just a sense of impunity that encourages other abusers of human rights, if you will, to continue doing so and not to be expected to be brought in court or sanctioned or even condemned in the public square, if you will. And I think that's dangerous because today maybe the U.S. is protecting, if you will, its ally, but tomorrow the perpetrator may not be an ally. And so even from a selfish perspective, often these states are thinking in a short-sighted manner, I think, and they're not thinking long-term about how it's existential to peace and security around the world to have as a core value accountability and to prevent impunity for abuses. So that's one thing I'm worried about.
And international law, of course, is not just about human rights. It's about the territorial integrity of states. Take away international law, any big country can invade any other country with impunity. Trade law. Trade law undermined now by the United States for the last 8 years, but still, there are trade rules that most countries tend to abide by, want to abide by. Eliminate them, and then, you get tariffs left and right, and the global trading system falls apart. There's whole aspects of international law, prevention of kidnapping of children, for example, and environmental law, the Ozone Treaty, one of the first treaties that actually bound various countries to reduce chlorofluorocarbons. So we just kind of think of the high-profile ones, but international law is kind of a basic framework under which we operate.
mean, just quickly, and then I think it'd be great to get to some questions. I mean, for me, I think so much of what we've observed in the context of Gaza has been sort of the loss of basic humanity, of the way that these horrors are being live streamed on our phones, and unless you are actively trying not to see it, it is very difficult to get away from the reality of what's happening. And what I fear is the way that is being normalized, and I think this certainly contributes to the lack of outcry over the Israel's illegal invasion of Lebanon, sort of the idea that this sovereign country is somehow no different in the eyes of at least sort of mainstream Americans. They're just more brown Arabs in the Middle East, even though they are not all Arabs. And it's just the level of racialization, just the racism at play here, I think is a crucial component of it. And I do fear that moving forward, as we're in a context of greater climate catastrophe, where we will continue to see these horrifying mass deaths and countries that are failing to protect humanity, I think, unfortunately, that Gaza will be seen as a crucial turning point where people knew what was happening and they saw what was happening, and yet it continued.
I would just maybe question the, quote, illegal invasion of Lebanon. A war in Gaza was going on. We can talk about it at great length, but I'm not too sure that Hezbollah had any right or reason to start firing rockets into Israel. They did cause the evacuation of 60 to 80,000 people. They are continuing to fire rockets into northern Israel and other parts, and I do think Israel has a right to self-defense. And if part of that right to self-defense is trying to prevent Hezbollah from continuing to do that, and it might, in fact, take entering Lebanon, they certainly have no right to stay. We've seen the disasters of that before, but I found Hezbollah's actions completely intolerable. I don't think they had any business doing what they did any more than they had.
But 83% of the rockets were coming from Israel towards Lebanon.
Not before October 7th, they weren't.
No, but in the context of post-October 7th.
Well, yeah, not post-October 7th. No, they weren't.
This is documented that the vast majority of rockets were coming from Israel towards Lebanon.
But rockets going from Israel to Lebanon were not there because Israel wanted to take over Lebanon or Israel wanted to invade Lebanon. They were there because they were trying to respond to rockets that were being aimed at Israel, and I continue to maintain
I'm just questioning the premise of self-defense here, given that the vast majority were coming from Israel towards Lebanon.
I mean, that's self-defense. Are you suggesting that you can only send as many rockets going one way as are coming in? I mean, they were being attacked. 60,000 people had to evacuate.
And 100,000 Lebanese had to evacuate before the invasion.
Now they do.
Before the invasion.
I'm just going to...
you
wanted to jump in.
I just want to come in, putting all of that aside. I think a few facts are critical to establish. Hezbollah is not Lebanon. Lebanon is not Hezbollah. Lebanon has territorial integrity and a right to sovereignty. That's in the international law. I think there's no doubt that Israel's attacks in Lebanon have been indiscriminate. As we were speaking today and yesterday, there have been attacks on central Beirut. 1.2 million people have been displaced from their homes. These are large, significant numbers. And I think at the end of the day, we can disagree about who started it, but it is critical to ground ourselves in the fact that civilians are being disproportionately affected and targeted, and that is in clear violation of international law.
I'm going to say that Hezbollah was responsible for the assassination of a Lebanese prime minister. It was responsible for assisting Assad to kill 600,000 of its own people. It was responsible and has been responsible for firing rockets at Israel for years. If Israel does not have and Hezbollah is a political party and the largest non-state military probably in the world, but certainly in the region, and it reports to Iran, not to Lebanon. So Lebanon is a state, but it has an obligation to control Hezbollah, and if it doesn't control it, then it unfortunately is going to suffer somebody trying to exercise self-defense.
In violation of international law. Yeah.
Okay, but I'm going to maybe follow up with questions from the audience, if that's okay. But I just want to note too, like, this is we're sort of getting into that point being made when you have that breakdown of international law, that what we see is continual violence, right? And one of the comparisons of a period when you don't have international law, as we know it right now, is World War II, which leads to international law, where globally there just almost wasn't international law, wasn't even in Geneva Conventions, right? And one of many of the conversations I've been at many conferences and workshops and pubs, et cetera, talking about where we're going, is a real concern that we're headed to World War III and that Gaza is the beginning of that direction and maybe that turning point. So, but just leaving that segue to maybe take questions from the audience, and then maybe we'll have a sum up after all that, because we have a lot to say, obviously. Does anybody have any question you want to ask? Thanks.
Yeah, so I think acknowledging that the application of international law is certainly far from perfect, and probably worse than the application of law at the domestic level, given some of the, apologies, it's been a long day, given some of the considerations you mentioned about how there are, 200 countries in the world that are all, subscribing to this international standard. As we move into this more chaotic kind of environment where we see more wars breaking out and more conflict, and perhaps as society becomes more and more removed from the horrors of World War II, and generationally, younger generations are less, I think, in touch with that as maybe just a theory. But my question is really around, how do you propose to strengthen international law, and what can societies do, societies that subscribe to these principles, that want to advance, the international law. I almost said international rules-based order. But in terms of strengthening those principles and the application of those, knowing that we probably can't strive for perfection in the application of it, but that it can continue to constrain the behavior of actors who would otherwise, without it, feel empowered or emboldened to take more risks and commit more atrocities. So just really that key point around, how do we strengthen the application of international law?
I would say a few things. One, it's an obligation on states around the world to ensure that their domestic laws are in line with their international legal commitments. We have a number of countries where that's not the case. So a good faith effort to actually bring domestic laws in line with international law is essential. Another place where this happens is in domestic courts. Many countries who kind of sign on to international treaties, those treaties are obligatory on them, irrespective of whether it's in the domestic law, often because their constitutions recognize international legal frameworks. It's important for lawyers to be citing to international legal arguments, to be developing the jurisprudence around it. That's often a very compelling way, just because we know domestic courts often their findings and their verdicts are much easier tend to be more binding in effect, if you will, much easier to implement or enforce in that setting. And so reinforcing your arguments using both domestic law and international law is critically important. I think teaching international law properly, a lot of countries around the world don't have proper international legal coursework or training that's available to folks. It starts from the very beginning, and if law students and lawyers don't have access to that knowledge, they can't build it into their day-to-day practice and the ways in which they work. I think in our kind of public messaging, it's critically important to ground ourselves. The idea behind international law was this universality, and so this is something that should be bringing us all together, irrespective of politics. You know, at the end of the day, it comes down to the individual and collective rights of people and these aspirations for a better world, and so it should be a ground that we can agree on, if you will. And so referencing it, citing to it, not treating it as this kind of archaic thing in textbooks, but rather something that can help improve your life, improve the everyday life of citizens. I think that's important for folks with a platform to do as well.
John or Annelle?
Well, I think it would be helpful if governments like the U.S. wouldn't undermine things like the ICC. Biden threatened to sanction the ICC, and as has been mentioned previously, where there are a lot of concerns about how these institutions are going to fare under a Trump administration 2.0. And furthermore, you know, the need in general for UN Security Council reform, for these institutions to evolve and adapt. As May mentioned, these were set up in a very different context. And I think that we are at a point where, while it is true that they have thus far prevented World War III, which was their initial intention, I don't think that they will maintain sufficient credibility in order to maintain participation from the rest of the world unless they are reformed and allowed to reflect changing norms and values.
Okay. And next, yeah.
Sorry, it was a bit like up there. I wanted to first thank the panelists for taking the time to come and share their insightful feedback and thoughts with us. And a question that kind of comes to my mind in the realm of the digital era that we're in right now, where there's a tremendous amount of misinformation and a lack of adequate information. You know, we do live in an era where it is obviously post-1948 and the Nakba, but the issue is that maybe perhaps not everybody is aware of the track record of what's happened post the Nakba, especially with some of the actions that have taken place in Palestine and many of the folks that have been harmed, whether that's specifically in Palestine or in the neighboring regions. I guess a question I have for the panelists who have the expertise that they do is, what would you say to folks that are committed to their biases and that misinformation that we see today, where we only talk about one aspect without really sitting down and perhaps opening a book and seeing what's come before that? You know, when we talk about, for example, what Yahya Sinwar has said without the track record of what Netanyahu or Gallant or other folks have said, perhaps my question is, what are your thoughts on misinformation and the personal biases that we often have as we navigate this world that we live in today? Thank you for your time.
Thanks.
I couldn't agree more with the question and the problem. I think too many of us, we're sticking in our own lanes, we're fighting for our own team, and we're not prepared to move into the middle and see the other side. There are two very complex narratives in the Middle East, and you've got two peoples who see themselves as victims. One of them's a huge asymmetric power, but it doesn't take away from the fact that that asymmetric power came out of hundreds of years of pogroms and discrimination and the Holocaust, and they've never forgotten about it. And for the Palestinians, this nation was dropped upon them, and they faced the Nakba, and etc. So those narratives are there. All of us have to try and understand where these two people have come from. That doesn't, I'm not talking about moral equivalencies. I'm not talking about what has to be done now. I'm just saying try and understand where the other person's coming from on the street, in school. Don't judge. Just listen. And, you know, maybe we'll make the world a little bit of a better place.
Thanks. Annelle, May, either of you?
I mean, I would just say this is precisely where international law comes in, that the universal application of a standard set of laws helps to push back against the differing narratives, the narratives of victimization, et cetera, which you can never really get beyond, whereas the purpose of law would be to uphold it universally, regardless of someone's perceived sense of victimhood.
I think your question was almost about empathy, more than disinformation, but a fuller picture, and something that we avoid using in international policy and diplomacy is empathy, right? Some people do. Walt will talk about strategic empathy, but I think that it's a little bit of a different meaning.
And if I could just add.
Yeah, ma'am.
Yeah, I think I want to build on Annelle's point, because I think it's empathy, and I think here's where I think international law is a grounding force. International law is the same concept that allows me to say hostage taking is a violation of international law, and it's the same concept that allows me to say indiscriminate targeting of civilians. And it's not about picking favorites or making friends. It's the law. It's what every individual is owed. And I think in that there is a real power, because it allows us to rise above kind of all of this. We're all human. Everyone has a story. Everyone has background. But I think the real purpose of international law is to say no tragedy is worse than the other, or this is not about moral equivalency. It's not about comparison. What's illegal is illegal. And when our friends commit violations, we have to call them out, because that's what good friends do. And so it builds this whole other worldview. And so I think I felt through this conflict, it's been immensely painful, deeply personal for many of us. But knowing that there is a framework out there to kind of know what's right, if you will, I think has been really freeing. And I invite you to kind of think about that and reflect in that, because it really allows us to move past this and talk about what's what without upsetting anyone. It's just, if you don't want to be called a human rights violator, don't commit human rights violations, Do
we have any more questions? Am I missing it? Oh, yeah.
Hi, sorry. I know the idea of reform was brought up by the panelists, and I just had a question on how do we start on reform, especially on large bodies that bring many countries together, like the UN and the Security Council. Where exactly, in more detail, would the reform need to start, and how would the reform look like hopefully in the near future, in order to bring change and to stop these kind of wars from happening again? Thank you.
I mean, again, unfortunately, I don't think we're likely to see any kind of reform under the coming Trump administration. And unfortunately, I do think the United States is going to have to be on board with any of these kinds of measures. At the same time, the fact that the Biden administration recognized that there was a need for this, I think, shows evidence of progress. It is just unfortunate that they did not expend his limited political capital to actually make those reforms happen. I think as far as those of us who are not in the White House, I really liked May's point about the need to sort of socialize ideas of international law and the importance of these institutions just more generally, that this is a way moving forward for a growing consensus, that this is something that is absolutely necessary for the future functioning of the international order. And furthermore, I mean, for me, it is something that I wonder about sometimes. I mean, on the one hand, that these institutions are clearly unable to deliver accountability or justice, but that they have prevented another massive war, which would be catastrophic for humanity. And so needing to also think about, how to overcome those challenges as well, I think is a discussion that is very much needed, and I don't have a good answer for it.
I mean, unfortunately, 5 countries have a veto at the Security Council. None of them want to give up that veto. In order to reform the Security Council, they all have to agree France and the UK have no business being there, maybe the EU. And then if you want to expand it, which is the idea, expand it to give representation more globally. The Mexicans don't want the Brazilians, the Pakistanis don't want the Indians. I mean, there are some key countries that you would say, oh, they should be on the Security Council. Well, it's quite complicated. So, I mean, it would be a great thing, but it's, the best thing would be to take away the veto from countries that have it. But I don't think that's going to happen, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I would say short of UN Security Council reform, there are other measures. There is, for example, something called Uniting for Peace, which is a way for the UN General Assembly to circumvent a UN Security Council veto. There is some kind of technical stuff. There's a lot of great books written about UN Security Council reform. People way smarter than I have great ideas on this, but it is complex, it's difficult, and it requires political will. So I think short of that, kind of finding other spaces where international law can be contested and engaged with, like the ICJ, like the ICC, like the human rights treaty bodies. There are so many other spaces where international law, soft law, is regularly being developed and adapted. Now that we're talking about AI, there's potential kind of what international law will look like around AI. There's just so many discussions happening often. And so this is a dynamic field. Even the disagreements or debates we have in this space, right? This is all for the better of international law. We're testing it, we're applying it, we're seeing who it covers and how it covers and if it's serving the purpose it's meant to. And so kind of active, I think, discourse and debate, which happens a lot in this space, I think finding those creative spaces. And then third, I would say activating some non-traditional states that have not been as active. For example, even South Africa's involvement in the ICJ case, whether you agree with the case or not, that's a good thing. It's good for states to be holding each other to account because our international system is not meant to be based on some states are better than others. All states are likely committing human rights abuses. Obviously, the degree varies at various points. The complicity, the narrative, all of that changes up and down. But the idea is a system in which states are holding each other to account. And so I believe it strengthens international law for more states to be talking about each other's records. No one is going to be perfect, but I think that practice is a good practice, and I hope we see more of it also.
As we know with Canada and Indigenous nations, for example, since we're in Canada. Is it okay?
I just want to leave people with a little bit of hope. 4 years after the 1973 war between Egypt and Israel, Anwar Sadat was in the Knesset talking about peace. And 2 years after that, there was a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. The South African ambassador is not here, but I know quite well that many, many people thought that apartheid was going to last 50 years longer than it did, and one day it disappeared. And I was in the foreign ministry in 1989, and I can tell you no one, not in the United States and not in Soviet Union and not in Canada, thought that the Berlin Wall was going to fall. Events like October 7, have had horrific results, but they can also sometimes change people and views. And, we can only hope that once this horror show ends, people will begin to realize that in order to prevent another October 7, Israelis and Palestinians have to begin to live together. So we just have to have some hope, and we all have to try and work towards that. Unfortunately, the Trump administration and Bibi Netanyahu, to some extent, have come in between. But the Palestinians need a national project. The Palestinians also have to get their act together. They've got to bridge the ideological and the geographic gap, and they've got to demonstrate to themselves and the world that they are ready to take on Israel and the world and become a state. And that's part of it, too.
Is it okay if that you answered my question I was going to ask to close out John, was asking each of you where you see us headed and if you have any optimism for the future. And I think you kind of did that, John, from your perspective. And I was wondering if you may and Annelle would be willing to close out with your thoughts.
Since we're not going to have the final sort of Trump 2.0 panel, the one thing I did want to say on that, while I'm very alarmed about Trump coming back, and I do worry about the future of American democracy, I hope that there may be some possibility that the Trump administration listens to the many American voters who were horrified by the genocide. And we know that some of the messaging about Trump as an anti-war candidate specifically resonated in swing districts, that people cited this as contributing to their votes for Trump. So I'm not optimistic that actually putting the so-called America First policy would actually necessarily lead to a less interventionist U.S. foreign policy, given who he's appointing and who he's surrounding himself with. But at the same time, I do think that there is a change coming, if not under this administration, then at least in the future. I do think Americans are tired of unnecessary wars abroad. And I also think many Americans, especially young Americans, are tired of unconditional support for Israel. So while I have very little optimism for the near or medium term, I do hope that in the longer run, maybe we could start to see a change.
May?
Yeah, I think for me, where I see hope is just evolving opinions and open-mindedness on this issue. I think whether it's in the international legal community or the policy community or among the everyday public, we've seen more and more people follow with great care and great humanity what's been happening in Gaza following October 7th. And I think the key to this is kind of an engaged populace and an engaged set of actors willing to do something about it. And I kind of gave plenty of examples earlier about how advocates and lawyers are making the most of this moment and really taking what are words on paper and trying to give them life, to breathe life into them, whether it's in the form of changes in government policy or court verdicts or opinions. I think those are critically important, and so I deprive my hope from the fact that there are people who are thinking about this day and night and who are not going to let up until the international legal framework serves everyday people in the way that it was meant to.
Thanks, and thanks for the excellent panel.